Yeah, that's what we'll be talking about today. Federal government's approval of the National Development Plan from 2021 to 2025. As you've seen there, we've got Mr. Bukar Kyari, who is an economist and former chair of the Nigeria Economy Summit Group. Good morning, and thank you for coming on today.
Good morning.
Well, this plan, I mean, much as I know my guys have talked about several times. Do we have a plan for this country? What is the plan? What is the policy? I was still in the process of planning to plan, but now this, is out there. And so for you, how does that come across?
It's better to have a plan than no plan at all, which actually has been the story of Nigeria since the 80s, because I think the last development plan was somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 1980 or thereabouts. Now, planning gives a nation certain things. It prioritizes items that require the attention of government, particularly infrastructure. Now, we've been talking about the lack of proper infrastructure for a long time. And the reason is very simple. When people get elected, whether it's governor or president, they talk about all of these in their manifestos. However, when they come into the office, the day-to-day crisis takes over. And when you don't have a plan, then anything goes. The crisis du jour takes over, and then you end up, running from pillar to post. And then before you know it, you have done your 4 years and it's up. So planning is a critical piece.
With the planning, just as you referenced, is we have had these development plans since 1960 at least.
Correct.
And they always go national development plan from this to this, then another one from this, first national development plan, second national development, down through the ages up until now.
Yeah.
Now, so as you said, it's good to have a plan.
Right.
But to what end is a plan that continues to roll over?
It's always a rollover because a nation is always in existence.
So those are rolling
now,
plan.
They are rolling plan. They're rolling plan. But seriously speaking, yeah, at least in those days when we had the 5-year national development plans, you would see the effect of those plans at the end of the 5 years, whether it is building schools, hospitals, all the secretariats in various states, all the housing estates, all the critical pieces of infrastructure of those days were all built under those national economic development plans.
Durable.
And they also lasted. In fact, in some states, most of the standing infrastructure had been done in those days, and they still continue to stand. But because we lack those, the plan did not continue after, I believe, 80 or 80 something. And therefore, the plan comes from somebody's head, and he executes it, and it's rubbish. Whereas in those days, it is well documented, and people take it very seriously. So it's good to go back to the practice of having national development plans.
Much as it's good, it's good to plan. I mean, that's the right thing to do. But given our own reality here, because this is a plan 2021 to 2025, the government will exit in 2023.
Yes.
And if people look at it from 2015 and probably up until now, they look at the inflation rate, they look at the unemployment rate, they look at the GDP, they look at the youth unemployment, they look at several indices. Those figures have gone south, and that's how those numbers are. So and we know that perhaps when one government leaves and another comes, there isn't any guarantee that they will continue in that same light. So what if, what's the guarantee that, well, if they start off with this plan? Because the question some ask is, why start this plan now when it's just going to be, well, if the next government comes in, it will be 2 years into the plan. The government might say, well, we looked at your figures, your economy figures, for the period with which you were there. They weren't exactly encouraging. So I think I've got a better plan. I don't think I want to stick with this plan. And I jettison this plan. That's a possibility.
Right, and that's the problem with democracy. But the other element is that you can actually make it an aspect of law. If you were to pass a law to make it binding on any new government that comes in place, to continue with the plan.
Ekiti State
With a,
is doing that.
with a caveat, exactly. So you enshrine it in the laws of the land, and therefore anybody swearing in to uphold the constitution, etc., would have to abide by that plan. Now, you may end up saying, well, it wasn't my plan, but for the sake of the nation, it's a national plan, therefore I am included in it, and we will execute it. Now, however, I think they did not pay attention to education as I would. So he may end up supplementing it rather than, pushing it aside and come up with a new plan. Guess what? Even if the person were to bring a new plan, it would mirror what had been done anyway. But if you just want to have a room for complementing it or supplementing it or altering it slightly, that should also be enshrined in the law.
I get that point. But, not that I'm trying to poo-poo the plan, but just looking at our present reality.
Right.
We've had different finance ministers or ministers of planning who have said, well, usually, election years are usually nothing really goes on. We can't focus. And that year is part of this plan.
Correct.
So there's definitely going to be what we can refer to as downtime for this particular plan.
So election years in a democracy tend to actually be a year of excesses, in the sense that what happens is, how should I put this without necessarily appearing if I am condoning corruption. But generally speaking, in democracies, towards the election year, the budget would be larger than usual. There would be spending. There would be a lot of activities to show to the electorates that we're doing something, right? And so it becomes expansionary. It may, bring in additional inflationary pressure and so on and so forth, but the economy would be flush with liquidity. That's the case with most democratic systems. So that year becomes the year of the fat years or the fat months or whatever. And in a sense, it's like bribing the electorate. That's what I was trying to...
So essentially, we can say, is that also part of the plan?
It may not necessarily be part of the plan, because the plan would look at the entire 5 year, right? Mm-hmm. And within that 5 year, I would imagine that those people who are actually conceiving that plan are smart people. And because they are smart people, they know that there would be an election year in the process. So
I asked that question because you are an economist. So I'm just trying to look at, because if the question would be, is this a sincere plan? Because if we're looking at it like, okay, this is going to happen.
Right.
Consequently, we're going to factor it at a particular time.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the economic implications for economists and for the nation eventually.
Right.
So that's why I'm asking, so of what essence is a plan that we have that is not sustainable?
Sustainability is one
because
thing.
The question there is, Justice Chamberlain said, one government comes in and another one can say, no, I'm not going with that plan. I'm good. So it speaks to a lack of vision or a coordinated national vision. If every government that comes into office has to have a plan.
Look at it this way. There are some fundamental things we need in the national economy. We have always been, at least for the last 20, 25 years, we've been complaining about lack of basic infrastructure, roads, rail, whatever, all those infrastructural items. We know that the healthcare system, so the healthcare system is horrible. We need it fixed. We need the educational system to be fixed. And of course, the critical piece and catalytic infrastructure, which is electricity, need to be fixed. Now, if you encode those in your national economic development plan, it doesn't matter which party comes in. No matter how left or how right that party is, it would see that that is good for the benefit of all. Mm. Now, execution, plan is plan, right? Mm-hmm. Execution is the most important thing. if I see a national development plan of a country, and 5 years later you look back and see that only 20% of those elements within that plan had been done, that is a poor execution. The plan may be good, but the execution was horrible.
Shouldn't we then be asking questions around that?
Right.
The ERGP has elapsed.
Exactly.
For instance, what's your assessment of its performance?
My own personal assessment of ERGP is that it wasn't executed well. It hasn't. And the reason is very simple. I think there were some assumptions that were made in the ERGP, and those assumptions had changed. You know, price of oil, production of oil, the GDP growth, all of those. Now, when you make certain assumptions and things change, you need to go back to the drawing board and modify your plan, so to speak, because things are not the same as you conceived.
These are, it's, the ERGP is not just alphabet. Economic recovery and growth didn't go as planned. Now, we have a national development plan.
Yeah.
It would seem that those kind of plans don't go as well as borrowing plans.
No. So economic recovery plan was necessitated by an event. And that event was the 2016 recession. So it is to recover from that recession that the ERGP came about. Now, I know when it was conceived. It was at a summit where I was chairing, and we, together, both the private and public sector, but primarily the public sector, came up with this plan, and the execution were based on certain assumptions. Now, that's history, right? Whereas national development plans, the way I understood it, is a rolling plan in any country. China, for example, has been doing it for close to 80 or so years. I think it's over 60 years now. China has been doing, I think theirs is 6 or 7 year plan. And they consistently do it. Now, earlier on, the implementation or execution of their plans were poor. But as they continuously did it, they begin to improve on how best to do the execution.
And we saw
and that resulted in the change in living conditions of the citizens.
Exactly. We've seen that over the years.
And,
can we say the same for our clients?
And that is what that's what my hope is. I mean, I'm going to be a hopeful human being. As bad as things are in Nigeria, I still believe that there is a trigger somewhere that would make us start to do the right things. And how and when would be a question for everyone.
Yeah. How come borrowing plans seem to go, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How come some, borrowing plans seem to go easier? The federal government has just received approval to go borrowing again, which is further pushing up our debt burden, and which even agencies, ministries, departments, and agencies are already being a little cautious. What's your assessment of that one?
The debt issue is a major subject for the country to seriously look at. I think what we need to look at is how much debt do we owe, and we need to also dissect the debts into external versus internal. Talking as a layperson, let me put it this way. The domestic borrowing can be easily handled, right? But the external borrowing is where the real issue is. As a percentage of GDP, it's low. So when you are borrowing externally, you have to look at two things. Is it sustainable, as you put it? The key for Nigeria is not just the borrowing, but any time you borrow, you make sure that your revenues have gone up to be in a position to service the debt well. So debt to GDP ratio is around 30-something percent, 32 or 33%. But
not 70.
No, debt to GDP is still low compared to most highly indebted countries. But debt to export earnings is still decent, because our export earnings is around 20 or 30 billion dollars a year. Now, the debt service to exports, but debt service to revenue of government is abysmally low. That's where the 70% or 60% come in. Now, that's the reason why people are saying it's not sustainable. Now, when you look at our revenue generation compared to our GDP, it's at 5%. So if you look at the entire sub-Saharan Africa, the revenue generation to GDP is around 20% for the entire sub-Saharan Africa and 30% for sub-Saharan African countries that export oil, like Angola and the rest of them. So what that means is that Nigeria needs to generate 4x or 6x of the revenue it's generating right now. If our revenue generation were let's say 5x of what it is now, that debt service will not be a burden.
So now, if you juxtapose the development plan with the debt burden that we already have now, what are we looking at?
So if you have a development plan, the development plan, if it is well written and well conceived, it includes the sources of financing that plan.
And the financing,
in the financing, debt will come in addition to foreign FDIs, foreign direct investments. So you have to have an easier economic environment for investors to come in. Investors shouldn't be frightened of coming into Nigeria. Right now, as things are going, over time, they may be scared. They may go to a less riskier country than us.
Well, the figures already show that they've been frightened for decades. Because if you look at what we do compared to India, which was referenced several times, I mean, we used to be a power India some decades ago, but now India is doing over 120 or 60.
Right.
We are doing 2 billion.
Yes.
2 billion.
Yes.
So look at that. That tells you so much about the
Even
fight.
from just 10 years ago, our numbers are, I think we were doing about 20 or 30 billion a year in FDIs.
And now,
I remember,
years back.
A few days ago, Chamberlain was quoting that, referencing the sources of generating some of these revenues as the private sector. Right. So I'm at a loss.
Yeah.
So if the private sector is one of the sources of revenue generation for the federal government, and this same private sector is stifled, the business environment is stifled, and MSMEs cannot survive 5 years based on all of the regulatory apparatus and some of the issues, soft and hard infrastructure that you talked about the other time. Where then is government going to get the money from?
So here are some of the elements that I'm looking at. I mean, I haven't seen the plan yet.
No, but they say 85% of that fund of 348.7 trillion will come from private sector.
Exactly, and I hope that they would also consider selling their dead assets. The federal government and indeed the subnationals as well have somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think according to PwC, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 900 billion dollars of dead assets. These are assets that are not generating any revenues for them. Now, if you can...
That's for the federal government.
That's the federal government. Now, if they can offload even half of that, even at a fire sale, there is Christmas promo, coming by 2 for 1, whatever, and you can inject so much capital into the development plan such that, if well executed, we can end up forgetting about even the debt burden that we have. Can you imagine? And giving the federal government another 100 or 200 billion dollars. I don't know what your thinking is about, but then again, we can either go into town.
Do these dead assets include some 12,000 or 16,000 abandoned buildings or abandoned projects of the federal government?
Exactly. There are factories. There are elements of buildings that belong to, say, the power holding company, et cetera, et cetera. There are many assets that actually sit idle, generating practically nothing in terms of revenue or value to government that they can offload.
Well, one of the key questions we always like to ask governments or whichever, at whatever point is, how do they hope to achieve all of these plans and boost the private sector or the economy without addressing the power challenge? How do they want to do that?
The fundamental thing is to have policy that is friendly. The private sector has means of attracting capital, whether it's foreign or domestic. And I would hate to see huge borrowings from the part of the private sector to invest. They should rather actually partner with, entities or firms outside that do have the capital and the know-how in executing whatever that is needed. Because generally speaking, private sector has the creative endeavor and innovative flair that they can apply in getting the necessary resources in executing
Encouraging
that.
Can I talk about
that.
the leakages?
Blocking the leakages.
So,
it's a very important one.
We've never even looked at that area
Yes.
alone because,
Yeah.
I mean, the leakages, goodness me, they are huge.
Right.
And so if they were to take some serious consideration of those areas, and then what happens to the unspent budgetary funds year on year? We don't seem to hear a lot about all of those. So, and then his favorite part, the Auditor General's report.
That's a major leakage.
The Auditor General generally looks for those things anyway, because that's his job, right?
Well, yes, but so what does it do with them? You go to the National Assembly, you were talking about laws and policies the
Correct.
other time. It would seem like the laws and policies to checkmate those things are weak or not or not
Or
used at all.
in existence, yes. So the Auditor General reports to another arm of government to say that you have the oversight, and here are what I have seen, and do something about it. Because he doesn't have the power, because it's the people that hired him that he is policing. So the only recourse for him is to go to the National Assembly, which means he's doing his job.
Well, it's good to have plans, but there are some realistic things that need to be addressed if those plans are to see the light of day. And those are not exactly rocket science.
Right.
There's several persons and several people who are very, very capable in this country to ensure that those things, in fact, they can take us way beyond where we are now.
Right.
And without even looking at security. Capital is a coward.
Capital is a coward.
If leaves
runs out.
when it's ready.
Yes.
So if it's not secure, you can say all you
Runs
want
away.
about the plan, it won't go anywhere. But of course, we're hopeful that some of these things can work. Even the hope is not a strategy. But we always thank you. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
All right, we're back in a moment. Don't go away.